God chooses to be gracious to some people because he takes pleasure in being gracious to some people and not to everybody, and that God finds election pleasing to himself. And I say, okay, now the cat's out of the bag. Now God is demonically, diabolically capricious and arbitrary, because this whole game that he plays, choosing some and rejecting others, saving some and damning others, is just a divine comedy, where God is just getting his jollies, you know. And again, we have a tendency to darken counsel without knowledge and come perilously close to blaspheming the Holy Spirit at this point. Because we've missed one word in the text. That God does this choosing and electing according to what kind of pleasure? According to the good pleasure of his will. That word makes all the difference in the world, folks. Because there's no such thing as the bad pleasure of God's will. God does not take pleasure in evil. We take pleasure in evil. In fact, that's why we sin, because it's so pleasurable to us. If it weren't pleasurable, we wouldn't be enticed to it or tempted by it. But there is no evil will in God. The only thing that has ever pleased God is goodness. And the only pleasure that he's ever had is a good pleasure. And the only purpose that he's ever had is a good purpose. So let us never, ever suggest that in the mystery of his grace, that he is whimsical or capricious or arbitrary. And that just because the reason for our salvation does not rest in us, does not mean it's unreasonable, irrational, or that God is without a purpose, a counsel, or goodness.
You're listening to Renewing Your Mind with Dr. RC Sproul. 43offer.com.
And for whatever reason he grants, and for whatever reason he's always good. Hard is it for us.com.
Now, once again, here's Dr. Sproul.
Sometimes this difficult doctrine of election gets very easy, doesn't it? How hard is it for us to imagine that what is pleasing to God is always good, and that his purposes are always good. And for whatever reason he grants mercy to some and not to others, has to be good. That's not hard, is it? What is hard is to conceive of an evil pleasure in God, or an arbitrary action of God, to imagine your sovereign creator doing anything without a purpose, or doing anything without taking into account his own omniscience, his own infinite knowledge, his own perfect understanding of all things. Sure, mystery remains, and it will be there as we look through a glass darkly. But this isn't a mystery. At this point, we know, and I think we understand, that God is not arbitrary, and that God does not act without a purpose, or that God does anything unjust or unrighteous. It's just that we don't always like God's decisions. We don't always agree with the counsel of God. And sometimes I've caught myself saying to myself, if I were God, I would do this or that. And then I have to stop myself in my tracks and say, wait a minute, what an arrogant thought. And on the other hand, isn't it a good thing that I'm not God? Things would be a whole lot worse than they seem to be now in this world.
Today's lecture.